Thank you very much. That's a lot of me. So I'm hoping, though, that despite the very large picture of me and the mess in the background in the place that I'm staying, I'm in Amsterdam and it's 9 o'clock at night here. And I'm very glad to be with you, but I'm hoping this will be more of an interactive conversation. We very much have time for questions at the end, but I would like, with Hannah's permission and Tiffany's permission, to invite you to please join in throughout. I think it would make it a more engaging session if we heard from you, so please don't hesitate to raise your hand and we can take off the ginormous picture of me. Let me try to share some slides here. And let us present some slides full screen. Does everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Let's see if we can get the Canva actually working. So let me get us quickly started here with a story, but please, while I'm talking, I also want to invite you to continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. Even if I can't see it while I'm talking, I'm sure your peers would like to know who's here, where you are right now, what agency you're with, and I'm going to ask you some questions throughout, and please invite you to participate both out loud and again in the chat, as our mutual and shared experiences, I think, will be the most relevant for everybody here. So Hannah mentioned that I am currently serving as the Chief AI Strategist for the state of New Jersey. I previously, for the last 6 years, served as the founding Chief Innovation Officer for the state of New Jersey, which, as you may know, has had a 2-term governor by the name of Phil Murphy, pictured here. And I had the distinct pleasure and dread of being on the panel, on the podium at a press conference during COVID, one of initially daily and then weekly press conferences that many governors did throughout the pandemic, in which the governor says, does anyone out there know any COBOL? Because we have a lot of unemployed people. You may remember that during COVID, unemployment ballooned from 3 to 4%, depending on where you were, to over 20% in most jurisdictions. And our unemployment website, like that of many jurisdictions, was straining under the load. We had a site that was built in COBOL, which, for those of you who have never heard of it, was a programming language designed by Brigitte Hopper, the famous computer scientist, back in the late 50s and early 60s, and was held together by, chewing gum and chicken wire, basically. And to my great dismay, what people didn't realize is the governor was actually making a joke. But because of the serious context of the moment, people didn't realize it, and we got thousands and thousands and thousands of octogenarian computer scientists writing us to volunteer their time to help to fix our unemployment and other websites. So why am I telling you this story? And there, by the way, is a great story, and Hannah, you may be able to find it and put it in the chat, that story about spaghetti programmers and the firm that actually employs octogenarian COBOL programmers and is doing a pretty great and brisk business with people who know COBOL. Well, what happened was that our team in the Innovation Office, together with our Department of Labor, was tasked with the question of how do we actually ensure uptime and reliability and fix our unemployment website, which looked like this thing that you see on the left, with the I don't know if I can make it bigger here, but you will see it says in great big red letters, collecting unemployment insurance while working and not reporting wages is a crime, incredible lot of small text, incredibly difficult to use and really quite nasty in the presentation during a time that people were really desperately in need of these benefits. Why am I telling you all of this? Well, it turns out that when we dug in to really look at what the challenges were, what we didn't end up doing was hiring a bunch of 85-year-old COBOL programmers. What we realized is that our biggest challenge was the fact that by law, unemployment in New Jersey requires you to certify each week to attest to the fact that you continue to be unemployed so you can maintain your benefits. And because that certification, in order to minimize the load, the Department of Labor was giving people a time slot in which they had to certify, and that time slot was during the day. And what happened was, where are people during the day? They're out and about. The website didn't work on their mobile phone. It was extremely difficult to access. Long story short, the very first thing we were able to do was to say, we need to make this work on a mobile phone so that people can do their certification wherever they are, at the grocery store, at work, etc. Subsequently, when we dug in again to really try to untangle what the problem was, we discovered a lot of challenges with how the forms were written, how the language was drafted. Through a series of smaller iterative sprints where we made changes to the website, we have been able, since COVID, not only did the site never go down and we were able to serve people's unemployment needs, we have been able to shave 48 minutes off the time that it takes to apply for unemployment insurance in New Jersey. New Jersey is one of 2 states, along with Arkansas, that was selected by the federal government to be pilot creators of a better unemployment experience, and then share that with the rest of the states. Okay, long-winded introduction to say that really trying to dig in and tackle what the problem is the most important skill that I think you can learn, both for public service and, frankly, any kind of work that you're going to go into. And it is worth developing a set of skills that actually allow you to do so. I am actually trying to go forward on the slides here. Let's figure out what the problem is that doesn't allow me to do that. Let's go with the arrow key. There we go. That works too. Okay, problem definition is not the only skill of what I would call the public problem solver, or the 21st century problem solver, or the public entrepreneur, or really just the effective professional. There's a series of skills that I think it's really important to know. I'm not unique in my identification of these skills. The OECD, Bloomberg Philanthropies, and others that study what are the skills that you really need to know to be an effective public professional have identified this very similar set of both quantitative and qualitative skills. But the first, most paradigmatic and most important of those skills is the ability to define a problem. Here's just another representation in a graphic of the same thing that I just showed you, that there's a set of things that I think it's really helpful to know, especially if you go into public service, that is incredibly useful for you to develop to be effective at what you do, to make your work more enjoyable, and to make your work, again, more impactful, because you are able to get from idea to implementation in the work that you're doing. By the way, if at any point you want to offer a comment, a reflection, or you have a question, please don't hesitate to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Raising your hand, I believe, for those, we have a lot of extra whiz-bang buttons on this version of Zoom. It should be under, Hannah, tell me, I've changed the language on my Zoom.
It should be under the more, if you look at those, well, at least on mine, if you find more and the 3 dots and you go to reactions, there should be the raise hand functions. Alternatively, oh yeah.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I think that's the best way, sorry.
Great, and you can put things in the chat too, and we'll hopefully see it, just label as a question. Okay, so it's really important with any kind of a project management process to have a plan. To have a process for accomplishing something. And that always starts with this process of defining a problem. So let me start with a quick question to you, just to get some conversation going here, if people are willing to be not shy. And if you are, I might ask some of our OPM colleagues to kind of get us started. Is why, from your perspective, or why in your experience, is having such a process roadmap important to what you're doing? And are you doing something right now in your internship that does involve some kind of a project management process or roadmap? Warning, I am a professor also in my day job, so that means I will call on people. Do I have any volunteers? Let me start with one of our, let me make it easy for folks to begin with and just start with you, Hannah, if I may. Yo, you have somebody for me?
I'm seeing
Oh,
some comments come in the
excellent.
chat, and Lizeth is raising their hand.
Thank you. Lizette, tell us, where are you? What agency are you with?
Hi there, my name is Lisette. I'm with the FHFA at DC.
I'm going to enforce a no acronym rule. You have to spell it out because there are too many acronyms in the federal government. In my office, we used to have to pay a nickel every time you used an acronym, and we used it to buy everybody drinks at the end of the internships.
The FHFA is the Federal Housing Finance Agency.
Okay, and anything you're doing that's involving some kind of a project roadmap for the work that you're doing.
So we're currently working on a project to get together the mortgage reports for Freddie and Fannie Mae. And with that, it entails pulling reports from different systems, and me and another intern are planning the work out week by week so that we can get everything done in a timely manner. And if there are any roadblocks, we reach out to our supervisors to navigate from there.
And is there a problem definition process on your roadmap or some chunk of time that is devoted to identifying the problem?
We do. We get together Fridays to go over areas of difficulty or parts that we're not understanding clearly to get more clarification.
Okay. Anyone else want to add anything here? Or anything coming in the chat? Let's take a look here.
I'm seeing a few comments in the chat.
And I see just Justin. Is that a hand from Justin? Or is that a high five?
Yeah, no, that's a hand.
Okay, sorry to interrupt, Hannah. I thought that might be Justin. Do you want to video or not? You want to just chime in?
Yeah, so I'm actually at my desk in the passport agency. We don't really have cameras on our computers, but I am working on a project right now that is called the Brown Bag Session. It is helping us develop skills to help us after we are done with our internships and done with our pathways to see what we can improve on through resume building and through interview skills and through, learning how to interact with different agencies and how to write memos and how to respond to emails in certain ways. So that includes lots of surveys, a lot of, information taking, seeing what would be best to help you in this internship and pathways that you can then transfer to relatable skills for a career in the government.
So that's fantastic. And I'm going to move forward and I want to ask both of you and others. I want to talk a little bit more about this problem definition piece of it, and we can get in some more of the comments also from the chat. And by the way, I will say that for our question period at the end, all questions are fair game, whether it's about the topic or you want to talk about resumes or interviews or emails or life in the federal government or state government. I'm happy to talk about anything as we get to the end. We'll try to stay on topic for the core part of our discussion. Just moving us forward in the conversation, let me say that I think that if the goal is to get to implementation, to Lizette's point before, you have to work backward from the end to actually figure out how you're going to get there. And especially if you're on an internship where you only have a certain amount of time, the ability to figure out what you can accomplish, setting up and identifying your milestones and your deliverables, ensuring that you have aligned the project to the time that you have, such that you can actually accomplish something at the end. Obviously, you're not going to solve all the problems of federal housing and the cost of housing in America in a 2-week or 4-week or 8-week internship. But there might be some very small piece of that which will contribute if you can identify it. And to Justin's point as well, trying to ensure that you will be prepared for the opportunity of applying for federal service really means having a kind of pathway along the way. But what I want to make the case for is a rigorous process for really defining what the problem that you're going to solve as part of that. So let me ask you about the counterfactual, whether you've ever been involved in a project where the problem was not defined correctly. And what did that look like? I'm going to ask you both ways, what happens if you don't define it correctly and what happens if you do define it correctly. Has anybody ever worked on something where the problem turned out to be improperly defined? My COBOL example is one of them. The problem was not that we lacked COBOL programmers. The problem was that we didn't have a website that worked on a mobile phone. Brittany, tell us, where are you in the world?
I'm in Philly at the US Mint.
Ooh.
Yep.
Money, money, money. Okay.
I see a lot of coins every day. There are projects that I have seen meetings for while my last month at the Mint, where they just have had the same meeting over and over every week for like 2 years, and nothing really gets done in a week. So every week it's the same meeting.
Without disclosing any office gossip, what's your diagnosis about if there's a way you can talk about this, what's your diagnosis, like what is the circle that people are going in?
There isn't very much a defined goal where we're going. We know like it's got something to do with the future of the die shop, which is the things that you use to press the coins. But the future of the die shop is a little too broad of a problem, so you end up with a lot of meetings that point in different directions and never in like a coherent single direction.
Oh, that is such a good example. And I am guessing they don't serve snacks either.
They're on Teams.
Oh, even worse. Oh, it gets worse. Okay. Let me ask, has anybody here ever had formal training in problem definition? And here you could just put up your hand and again, use the more button, the 3 dots on the bottom right, which will have a raise hand button if you have. So I'm seeing one hand go up. How many? Let me try to, because of the slides. Whoopsie. Let me go back here. Is it just one hand? Is that all I see in terms of formal?
Brian said a little in the chat.
Brian says a little, and Grace is a hand up. Was it Grace? Do you feel like telling us where you've had some training and where you learned it?
Yeah, hi. So I'm currently getting my master's in public policy at the moment, and last semester we were taking a class focused on problem definition and public policy solutions. So a lot of that was discussing really very similar to this topic of how to get to the point of the issue, because a lot of times you have a very vague concept that needs to be narrowed down. So that was the goal of our semester, was narrowing down large issues so they can actually be solvable.
That sounds exactly right. If you remember, what was the broad issue you started with and where did you end up?
Yeah, so I worked on a project with digital equity in Massachusetts. And the original prompt that we were given was not enough citizens in Massachusetts have access to internet or broadband. And that's obviously there's a lot of different aspects to that. We originally assumed it was an infrastructure issue where people did not physically have access. It actually turned out to be more so of pricing and market competition where it was not affordable. So language also played a little bit into that of how to word the issue.
That is a hugely helpful example. And I think it's gonna come in handy in just a second. I'll be really interested, Grace. And who else said you had a little bit of problem definition training? Where did that come from? Brian, okay. I'm gonna ask you both to weigh in just a second as we get into talking more about how to do this. There obviously are a lot of problems in the world. Some of you have probably seen the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 global goals that 190 countries have agreed to. These are the sort of top level definition of large challenges that really every country faces. There are still many things missing here. Within each of these, there are smaller problems, but these are intended to kind of offer a taxonomy of the challenges that we are facing in the world. Challenges that some people refer to as wicked problems. And if you've taken any kind of a public policy class, you've probably had some conversation about wicked problems. They're the kinds of policy problems and challenges that you are facing at work. Problems where we don't have agreement about what the solution is. We don't have agreement about what the problem is, and we don't necessarily have agreement about how to get from the problem to the solution, which can make this whole process just much, much more difficult, especially in a highly politicized environment. And we do want to talk maybe at the end a little bit about doing problem definition in a politically contentious environment. However, you've seen this quote or things like it, the time spent on actually figuring out what is that problem, what is the root cause of the problem, why is it really happening, is a really incredibly important skill to develop. So before our hour is up, I'm hoping that you're going to be able to, and I will be able to convince you that problem definition is extraordinarily important, and a couple of key skills for actually doing so, maybe with some assistance from other people like Grace and Brian and others who've had some training in this, or others of you who've been suffering the consequences of not defining the problem. I think it's a challenge that all of us are familiar with from COVID, because all of us are familiar, regardless of where you come from in the United States or outside of the United States, with the challenge of mask wearing that was so urgent during COVID, where public health authorities were asking themselves, how do we get more people to wear masks? And this is, I think, just a very accessible example because it's so familiar to all of us. So let me ask you, in this time in the chat rather than out loud in the interest of time, what would you say is the reason, if I asked you about, we want to start an initiative to get more people to wear masks, and I don't want to sit in a room going around and around, as we heard before, spinning our wheels around this problem. We want to really unpack, why is this problem actually occurring? What would you say is the reason why, where you came from, people didn't wear masks? So I'll invite you to put some of those answers in the chat as I move us forward, and then we'll come back to some of those answers in a second. And I think we'll see some interesting variation in what we hear. We started to talk about this, so I'm going to keep going here. Give you another quote, in this case from the famous American early 20th century philosopher John Dewey and pedagogue, who said that really the paramount essence of thinking is our ability to define the problem. And we have to, as the quote says here, we can't really start thinking about solutions until we have identified what the real problem is. So if I look at the chat, let me go back over here. People didn't believe they were effective. They had a lack of trust. We have discomfort, couldn't breathe. Those are very, very different root causes, right? The unclear guidance from the CDC. If the problem is that people think masks are uncomfortable, it's going to lead to a very, very different solution than if people, for example, let's take someone else's comment here. Isabel says they didn't believe they were effective for preventing the spread of COVID. So if you don't think a mask is effective, it's going to lead to a very, very different solution than if you think a mask is uncomfortable. And you can start to connect the dots. Elizabeth is talking about political stigma. We have other things here. You can start to connect the dots between the problem and what a likely solution would be, and they're going to look very different. And by the same token, if what you're doing is providing people with better evidence and information that masks are effective, and the real issue is that it's uncomfortable, you're not going to end up solving the problem for anybody. The reason, though, that I think problem definition is so important, and let me say this right at the outset, is that without a clear definition of the problem, it's very, very hard to get people to help you and work with you. In the kind of work that we're doing in government, everything that we do is very collaborative, whether it's across our team, whether it's across our agency, across departments, with the public, with different sectors. We're always working on these really knotty, gnarly, difficult challenges, and we have to collaborate with people to make a dent. It's just not something you can do by yourself. So if we don't have this ability to clearly communicate what the problem is, we're not going to be able to effectively collaborate on the solution. So I think that the most important reason is that solving problems requires us to work with other people, and so we have to have a shared vision for what the problem is. This is particularly difficult in the public sector, more so than in the private sector. In the private sector, typically when we think about innovation or invention, we think about the person like this pilot here who suffers from the problem themselves. So this is the guy who invented the rollerboard suitcase. Believe it or not, there were not always wheels on suitcases. Ask your parents. There was a day and age in which we just carried suitcases. It's hard to believe that no one thought of the idea that you could put a wheel on a suitcase, but that is the case. But it took somebody who suffered from the problem, namely a pilot who was sick of carrying his bag back and forth day after day in the airport, to come up with a solution to the problem. In government, we are very often working on a problem that we do not suffer from and that we have no firsthand experience with. You may not be taking out a loan from Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. You may not be buying commemorative coins from the Mint, or whatever, just to take two of our example agencies. You might have a passport, but you may not have had any trouble applying for your passport because maybe you have you're born in America and have a relatively uncomplicated situation. So again, we're very often working on problems that we do not suffer from, and therefore we need a process for trying to collaborate with others to really try to define and understand what is the problem according to the people who are most affected by it. Metaphorically, I like to think about it as akin to a statue. Defining the problem is like starting with that big block of marble. That's your big issue. And you have to whittle away until you find the statue within it. Or if you like, whoopsie, let me come back here. If you like food metaphors better, as I do, it's like peeling back the layers of the onion. So to, avoid, to kind of jump ahead to the end, we need a process for defining the problem. And I had the fun, I was just playing with the AI features in Canva, and I asked it to rewrite my slide, and it came up with this utterly unintelligible but quite poetic definition of problem definition, which I quite liked. So I put it up there for you for no purpose other than your amusement. I liked unveiling the essence of the enigma, sort of a little more romantic. But let me put the more easy to understand kind of definition that we're trying to get to, which is, as we heard before, we're trying to go from that large issue to that more specific problem. To do that by articulating what are the root causes, identifying who's most affected, and engaging them in that process of identifying root causes, and then reworking our problem definition, reframing it so that we get at the most urgent, the most important, and the most useful root cause for us to work on. So how do we actually go about doing that? That's what I want to spend the next few minutes talking about, but without, saving the thunder, bottom line up front. This is the basic process that we're trying to engage in. It's just, if we're honest, a really, really difficult thing to do. And it's an especially difficult thing to do in government. Why? In government in particular, but not uniquely in government, people want us to come up with solutions. Politicians especially, they're not looking for more problems. They want us to solve things for voters. If we work for an agency that typically gives grants, we are supposed to give a grant. If we work for an agency that writes regulations, we're writing regulations. We usually start with the solution. Who doesn't like a solution? Starting with a problem can often feel like it is taking time away from that process, but I would argue it is the most useful investment of time that gets us quicker to the solution instead of having us in that interminable teams meeting in Philadelphia talking about the dye shop. So I want you, for your own work, to think about a problem that your team is working on. And if you want, in the chat, if you feel comfortable with it, or again, we can bring let's take one or two more comments in the discussion out loud to tell us what is the problem you're working on. And in this case, I want to just talk about the big issue here that you're working on, just in one line. Any takers out loud? And any in the chat, also welcome. You don't have to do all those steps right now. Just looking for the bigger issue that you're working on. Hannah, anything in the chat?
Not yet. I'm looking at Liza, thank you again for getting us started.
So the big picture for my team is working on the compliance of Freddie and Fannie Mac to make sure that their reporting standards are safety and complying with soundness.
So complying with, say that last word again.
Complying with safety and soundness.
Safety and soundness. So compliance with safety and soundness. I think we would all have questions about what that means, but let me copy this down for a moment. So there's a kind of compliance challenge of some kind with these rules. Anyone else want to add anything? Let's take one or two more.
In the meantime, I can read a couple of comments coming in from the chat. So Purvi says,
Awesome.
Exploring different aspects of innovations like patents. And Ryan says, hard to find data about our different projects, financial information, dates, codes.
And Ryan, what agency is that with, or what area are you working in? Financial info, hard to find. Okay.
HR consulting, Ryan says.
Okay, so HR consulting in some way involved with the federal government. So I'm gonna bring up a next slide here to ask us to try to get a little more specific about these problem definitions. And again, you can do this in your own head. You can do it if you're texting with a team member or a friend, that's even better, or in the chat. So I'd love to, we've said here, we've named a couple of things. Let me see if we can figure out the answer to any of these questions. When does the problem occur? Where does it occur? And who is most affected by the problem? So for any of the things we've talked about, that Freddie and Fannie compliance challenge, or the patent innovations issue, or the hard to find financial information, anyone want to add anything? Can you say anything about when it occurs, where it occurs? Elizabeth, let me come back to you. Is there any more detail you can give us?
So this occurs quarterly whenever they release their reports, and then annually for the annual reports. And it would be regarding their financial statements and their disclosures. Okay, and it may or may not be as relevant, but is there a where in is there a geographical narrowing that would help, or no? No, because it covers like nationwide. Okay, I'm going to come back to talking about that in a second. And in terms of who's affected, is there a more defined population than everybody or the public? It would be the stakeholders and the individual entities themselves, as well as like homeowners and renters as well.
Okay, that's still a pretty broad universe of people. So I want to bring us forward to a couple more slides here. As you're thinking about how do you go from your big block of marble to your statue and get narrower to something you can tackle, trying to narrow the problem is obviously the first step that you want to engage in if it's possible. Now that can be hard to do, and we'll talk about some strategies for that. But it might be that there is a way to come up with a smaller challenge within the bigger one. So for example, this is an old example from the Freakonomics podcast. If you ever listen to that from Stephen Dubner, this was about, I won't belabor at length the details, but the broader issue here was educational achievement and accomplishment in rural China. Now that is a big place, rural China, and that is a broad set of issues. What they ended up doing here was in this project really narrowing in on a more specific geography, number one, in a specific province, in a specific county, and in this case, focusing very narrowly on the issue just of those children who have trouble seeing the board. And they launched a volunteer initiative to provide free or very cheap eyeglasses to kids who weren't able to see the board to improve their educational accomplishment. Now, are there issues of educational achievement across all of China? Of course. Is everybody affected potentially? Of course. Are many people suffering from other problems that have nothing to do with vision? Of course. But this kind of a narrowing allowed them to accomplish something that made a difference for some people in a way that could be potentially scaled to more people, and was a starting point and a jumping off point for potentially other initiatives. So I want to remind us that even if we have very large challenges about big issues that affect lots of people across the whole country, it doesn't mean we can't identify a smaller population or a smaller geography in which we can start something. This is a visual from a project called Transbase. If you're from the Bay Area, you may have seen this website. It is used to localize data and identify where bicycle fatalities and accidents are occurring. And it turns out when you look at the data and you map them, what you can identify is that the problem of bicycle fatalities is not distributed across the whole city. It's happening, a large percent of accidents are happening in a very small number of intersections. So again, even though the problem affects everyone, there's sort of an 80-20 rule. If 80% of the accidents are happening in 20% of the locations of the intersections, you can then really target the interventions that you're making. So again, even if you have something that affects everybody in the country, thinking about, is there a pilot? Is there an initial geography? Is there an initial neighborhood? Is there a smaller place in which you could work? If you're focusing on how to prepare interns for federal service, even though there are thousands of you across the whole of the federal government, potentially looking in one department, in one agency, in one unit, can be a really helpful way to try to identify what are the challenges that people are facing. It's also really helpful to think about whether the problem is chronic or whether it's acute. So when I talk about the when, there may be some specific seasonality, like, as Lisbeth said, when quarterly reports are filed or annual reports are filed. It may be that some problems occur in the day or the night or summer versus winter. And it may be that some problems occur year round, but sometimes they are chronic, that is, they are ongoing, as is the case with power shortages and power imbalances. But sometimes there are acute instances, as we saw in Texas a few years ago with the blackout. And the problem we're solving is very different if what we're trying to solve is an acute problem, like a COVID challenge right now, right here, versus an ongoing public health issue that might occur over time. So you're always trying to see, can I narrow it by time, by geography, by population in some way that gives me at least a starting point, even if it's not my ending point. I then want to add to my problem definition exercise what's sometimes called the 5 whys. I want to add a description of the root causes of why the problem is happening. And I want to do that by asking, why is the problem happening? Hence, it's called the 5 whys. And I want to do that 5 times. So I'm trying to repeatedly ask, why is the problem occurring? Just like a child says, why is the sky blue? And why is this? And why is that? We want to channel our inner child by repeatedly asking, why is the problem occurring, until we try to get to what is the fundamentally underlying root cause of the problem. Why aren't people wearing masks? Oh, they aren't wearing masks because they aren't getting good information about why they should wear a mask. Well, why aren't they getting good information? Oh, they aren't getting good information because a politician may be telling them that mask wearing is ineffective. Oh, why is the politician telling them that mask wearing is ineffective? Et cetera, et cetera. We want to keep going until we have a list of the root causes of the problem that can help us identify which problem we want to tackle. When we identify the root causes of a problem, it is not that there is only one root cause. People may not wear masks because masks are uncomfortable, and because masks are in short supply, and because a politician is telling them they shouldn't wear it. But that doesn't mean that each of those root causes is something that you are in a position to work on. It may be that they are equally important root causes, maybe they're not, but what you want to do is to find the root cause that's right for you to work on. Now, why might it be the right root cause for you? What does that mean for it to be the right root cause for you? Now I'm looking for a volunteer.
Benjamin says it's within your sphere of influence.
Good answer. What do you mean, Benjamin? Are you talkable? Can you amplify that out loud if you're in a place where you can talk?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit.
What agency are you with?
I'm with the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Cool.
I think there's a lot of problems and there's a lot of roots. A lot of problems are interconnected, but you'd ideally be focusing on mitigating the root of the cause, or root of the problem that you can actually address and change.
So there's a couple things in there, something you can actually change. What do you mean by something you can actually change?
Something that you can, like, within your power to address, like if we're trying to do something in Kenya, I know we're kind of limited based on the people that we know there, the contacts we have, and so ideally we'd be working through them, rather than maybe something that's happening in a different place. I don't know, that's not a really good example, but
no, it's a great example, and I think this idea of figuring out some place where you have a lever you can pull, where you can do something, is extraordinarily important. Is it Amika? Am I pronouncing it right? Do you want to add to that?
Hi. Yes, it's Amika.
Amika, my apologies.
It's okay. And yeah, I wanted to add to what Benjamin said. I think your capacity is really important. Like the how many team members you have, what the skills are, and it just adding to that influence, and like who you can find to like help collaborate with you can help kind of develop, like, can help determine like what you can, like, the right root cause for you.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you both brought up the question of partners, because it is not just something that you alone as the intern can do, but the question of who else is on your team, who are your collaborators, where do you have the staff, the talent, the resources, and the time in which to do something. And I'll add one other factor here that I think is really important, which is where you have the passion. This work is hard. It is underpaid. it is often very thankless and requires a great deal of effort. So it's really important to pick on something to work on that you want to get out of bed and do every day. There are, again, so many problems in the world, and they have many different root causes. You know, when COVID happened, we knew that we had a desperate need for a vaccine, first for testing and then a vaccine. I have literally zero training in biomedical sciences. I had no ability to do anything to contribute to a vaccine. But I did have ability and was really passionate about the question of how do we provide people with useful information. So my team and I helped to build a site for the state of New Jersey called covid19.nj.gov, where we provided the public with reliable answers to their COVID questions. We did a lot of other things, but you know, the site got used 150 million times. And we were able to have some impact by recognizing that whereas there were many issues all intertwined, as Benjamin said, and lots of things going on, picking something where we could make a difference and do something and that we cared about and had the talent to do made a lot of difference in terms of accomplishing something. And it is so addictive to accomplish something as opposed to sit in the Teams room in Philadelphia and spin your wheels. To go back to that example, it is so satisfying to be able to make a difference. And that's why this process can be really, really important. So making that list of whys, describing why the problem is happening, trying to do this with your teammates, never doing it alone, but you can start by doing it yourself, but doing it collaboratively to try to get an answer to that question is extraordinarily important. I'll offer one more exercise here that is sometimes called the 7 so whats. Which you can read for yourself here, is as before, where you're asking why does it happen. You want to also ask why does this problem matter, and to continue to try to get more and more specific with that as a way of narrowing your problem definition. Quick tip here. It's important to be sure that when you're defining the problem, you don't disguise the solution as the problem. What do I mean by that? If you're finding that, for example, you're working on a solution like we're going to build a website to do XYZ, the problem is not we lack a website. Or if you're working on a regulation, you don't just turn around and go, oh, the problem is we don't have a regulation. That is not what we mean by problem definition. Now, there does end up being a match between the solution and the problem, but the problem is really asking what is the root cause, why is it happening? When you do this, you really want to be sure to do it in a way that avoids jargon or technical terms, avoiding acronyms, because again, you're going to need people to help you. So really trying to get away from that jargon so that you can involve people in the process. Now, as we come to the end of some of these tips, let me offer this one, which is perhaps, I'm not sure if anybody's had this one before, but is part of this process. One way of describing it is what we're trying to do is to reframe our problem. So it's sometimes said that the right problem is a reframed problem. It should not look the same as where you've started. And through collaboration and conversation, we have that kind of a reframing process. I'm gonna, oopsie, I think I'm gonna go here. I'm gonna skip ahead to this one. My favorite exercise or way of thinking about the concept of reframing the problem comes from a book. Funnily enough, apropos, it's titled The Art of Problem Solving by Russell Akoff. And he tells the following story in this book. And some of you may have come across this anecdote before. It's not a new one. The problem is that of the hotel manager. The hotel manager has an elevator that is too slow. So what does he do? He calls an engineer and he says, my elevator is too slow. And the engineer, of course, says to him, you need a new engine. Your elevator engine is old. It will cost you $5 million. It will take 6 months to repair, and that will help speed up your elevator. Has anyone heard this anecdote before and want to give us the punchline? Hannah, you're smiling. Why don't you tell us the end of this anecdote, if you remember it?
I actually am blanking on it. I'm smiling because I've heard it before and I forgot what the ending was.
Anyone else? Okay, well, I'll tell you the answer. The answer is that what he does is he calls in the psychologist instead of the engineer, and the psychologist says, your problem is not that the elevator is too slow. The problem is that the wait is too long. And so when you think about the problem differently, suddenly it opens up the solution space. And your solution is not the $1 million engine. It is what? The $5 mirror, the Muzak in the elevator, the quiz. You ever see those quiz screens in the elevator that ask you trivia questions? Those are all designed to entertain you so that you do not complain that the elevator takes too long. So that is the concept of reframing the problem. It is by bringing in people with different backgrounds, different ideas, different ways of thinking, and through collaboration, we're sometimes able to see those new ideas around the problem. And that's why, as interns, you bring tremendous value and expertise, even to long-standing teams that employ public professionals who've been there for many, many years and know all the acronyms and all the regulations. By coming to it fresh and potentially with some different training and education, you might be able to see a different root cause, a different kind of focal point on the problem that can help unblock the team and how it's working. One or two last quick tips here, and then we'll open it up to any and all questions about this or other things. Another way of thinking about problem definition is sometimes called engaging in the process of positive deviance. Positive deviance was a term developed by Monique and Jerry Sternin, who are development professionals who worked for Save the Children. Remind me, who was it who worked for USAID? You might have come across their work at one point. They are development professionals who did work on poverty and hunger in Vietnam. And what they did was, instead of looking at children in rural Vietnam who were suffering from hunger, they looked at kids in similar economic circumstances, but who were not suffering from hunger, to understand what were their families doing differently as a way of helping them to understand what the problem was. And by looking at those positive deviants, the people who didn't have the problem, they were able to uncover that, in fact, their parents were feeding them multiple smaller meals a day and foraging for small proteinaceous bugs and other animals that could be added to the rice to provide more nutrition, as a way to unpack the solution space. Take another context, same technique. Eric Shadd is a mathematician in New York at the Icahn School of Medicine, and he uses AI to study people who have 2 recessive genes and do not manifest a disease. So that means looking in a population of millions, it might be, a few people who have 2 recessive genes but don't have a disease. He studies those people to try to understand potential cures to diseases, the positive deviance. We also want to try, when we can, to go upstream or backwards in time to try to understand the problem before it starts happening. You might remember when the vice president in the last, maybe it was a year or 2 years ago, when the crisis at the border was really heating up, all the news was talking about solving the immigration crisis upstream. She went to Honduras and she went to Latin America to try to address and identify how could we prevent people from leaving in the first place, rather than asking the question, what do we do about them when we get to the border? This picture is an illustration of a woman who works on programs not to promote pet adoption from shelters, but to ask, why is it that animals end up in the shelter in the first place? The answer to which is that it's often that people can't afford to feed their pets. And if you give them a small subsidy or give away some dog food or pet food, you prevent the pet from ever ending up in the shelter in the first place. So when you're thinking about how do I reframe the problem, You want to bring in other perspectives. You can try defining the problem upstream earlier in the process. You can try using positive deviance. These are all techniques for reframing the problem. So let me come back and show us again as we wrap up here. The problem definition process is this narrowing where we are trying to identify root causes in an effort to reframe the problem that we are actually working on. Learning the tricks for doing this with the team is a tremendously worthwhile process, lest we end up solving the wrong problem. Here is another exercise which I'll leave up, and you can, I realize that our acronym, my slide is incorrectly spelled. It is supposed to spell lasso. So my acronym is wrong here. It's supposed to be LASSO, but it works nonetheless. It's another way of asking you the same thing and asking yourself and your team, have I identified a problem that I am really capable of acting on with my team? Do I have an enthusiastic owner, supporter? Do I have a boss or a secretary or a director who is going to get back at the project that we are working on? And do we have something sufficiently specific that we can actually take action on it in the time frame that we have? Again, we might not solve the problem for all time, for the whole country, for all eternity, but we may be able to identify something that we can do. Let me come back to that example of the unemployment insurance. We were always looking for, and this is the essence of what's sometimes called agile innovation, something that we could do in a 2-week time frame, the time frame that an intern has, nothing more than that. And we were always thinking, what thing can we do in 2 weeks and push that out to make an improvement in people's lives? Doing those processes, and we don't have time to talk about this today, but I will just say that doing these processes should ideally be done in collaboration with the people who are most affected. And there are lots of free tools that are out there, like All Our Ideas, which this is a picture of, which is a free open source engagement tool. And there are others besides that you can use also to go out and ask the stakeholders, to ask your team members to help you with that process so that it's truly collaborative. And now we also have AI that can help us with the process. As you're thinking about defining the root causes of a problem, you can use generative AI to help you with that, to help you accelerate this process of saying, what are the root causes? Who is most affected? When are they affected? Can you help me narrow down and find an area where we can pilot something? AI is your friend here, and generative AI is your friend in helping you to do some of this work. And I'll close with one last example here, something on my mind, because you may have seen that the IRS, and I don't know if we have anybody here from the IRS or from the Direct File who's involved in the Direct File project. The IRS announced the successful completion of their pilot of the Direct File program, where if you lived in a certain number of states, you could file your taxes for free directly with the IRS. And this was really meant to be a solution to a problem that had been created by TurboTax and Intuit, which was supposed to have built free tax filing for the American public and instead made it incredibly difficult. I don't know if you've ever tried to access the free tax service. Anytime you try to access it, it tries to tell you to go to the paid service. So finally, the IRS has said, look, we're going to, stop leaving this to Intuit. We're going to try to build it for ourselves. And what did they do? They said, we know everybody pays their taxes, but we're going to start with a very, very small pilot. We're going to start with a very simple W-2 people who have no complicated exemptions, who aren't filing additional schedules. We're going to limit it to a certain number of states. We're going to test it rigorously, every single feature that we roll out, little small bits at a time, until we're sure we have something that works. That is why this project has been such a huge success. In contrast, I might add to the FAFSA application process, which has been somewhat of a disaster in the last year. that incremental small identification of little problems, tackling them one at a time, and building those Lego blocks until you come up with a bigger solution to a bigger problem is the way forward. So let me stop with that, see what comments, questions we can hopefully unspotlight both me and the slides.
Thanks so much,
and open
Beth.
it up to conversation.
I'm going to just stop the recording.